So, Dolly, now I'm delighted to introduce you. Of course, you don't require much introduction to this audience at all. Dr. Dolly van Tulleken is a policy consultant and visiting researcher at Cambridge University's MRC Epidemiology Unit. And this is where Dolly completed her PhD that examined UK government obesity policy. Of course, we've all read and cited many times your excellent paper in the Millbank Quarterly. So many of us are very aware of your past work, Dolly, and the high quality of that work. Also, Dolly is co-founded the 50/50 Parliament's cross-party Ask Her to Stand campaign, which helps women in the UK get selected and elected into Parliament. Dolly is also the Vice President of Ex-Offenders Employment Charity, Tempus Novo, and is an ambassador of the Military Veterans Charity Forward Assistance. So welcome again, Dolly, and over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to make sure I share my slides first thing so we know they're working. Is that all looking?
Yep, perfect. Excellent.
Perfect. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Well, a massive thank you, Christina, for inviting me, and to Elaine and Matea, who I understand totally make these things happen and have been wonderful to work with on the organisation side. So very, very grateful to you all, and very grateful because this is the first time I'm speaking about this. So you'll have to forgive me for any things that I get wrong or fluff up, because this is partly the practice as well. But it's been lovely to have a couple of weeks of a break and to come back to this, because it really is full of juicy insights, and I hope anyone who's been able to read it so far has been able to enjoy it, and I hope that this sheds a bit more light on some of the thinking behind it. So without further ado, I want to start with sort of why we created Nourishing Britain. And it might sound obvious to say, but because government policy to tackle food-related ill health just isn't working. Back in 2021, Henry and I properly first met, and I was actually I just had this paper published, my analysis of all government obesity policies in England, which I wrote with Professor Martin White, who was my PhD supervisor. And Henry had just finished the National Food Strategy and was getting ready to publish it. And I asked him what his plans were, having seen all of these government policies announced and not much implementation happen. I asked him what his plans were to make sure that his policy recommendations were actually implemented. Then we began working collaboratively to try and help make this happen. And that was back in 2022, right at the beginning that we started. And basically what followed were 3 years of food-related ill health policies being literally delayed, weakened, scrapped, or not adopted at all. And this absolutely spoke to the pattern that I had found through this analysis of all government obesity policies. And anyone familiar with this work will know that we've had almost 700 obesity policies published by the government for England in the last 30 years, and yet no reduction in the prevalence of obesity or related health inequalities in that time. And that's basically been due to 3 big problems that I found through this research. The largest proportion of policy ideas tend to rely on individuals changing their own behaviour rather than shaping the food system, so it makes it easy and affordable for everyone to enjoy a nutritious diet. And we know this doesn't work, and we know that it drives inequality. Secondly, that the vast majority of policies have been voluntary rather than mandatory, which we also know doesn't work. And thirdly, that the vast majority of policies have been abandoned, derailed, watered down, delayed into extinction, lost in the system, or forgotten altogether. As I say here, good policy ideas are only useful if they get implemented. Even the potentially effective policy ideas that have been proposed by government, many of which came in the last few years, haven't worked because they've never been given the chance to work. Politics has gone in the way of policy. So towards the end of 2023, after 2 years of trying to help facilitate policy implementation, Henry and I decided to find out why the politics are so challenging, and we thought we'd go straight to the top. So a brief, I know there's lots of people from academia, so I wanted to touch upon briefly how we did our research, but very happy to ask any questions, answer any questions about this or on email as well afterwards. But our main aim was to create a political manual for current and future politicians on how to effectively navigate the politics of food-related health policy. And our two main research questions were: what barriers did senior politicians face in government when trying to pursue food-related health policies, and what factors helped them overcome these? And so we ended up having 20 semi-structured interviews between March and October last year with prime ministers, health secretaries, and other key senior politicians. And elite interviews, as anyone knows, having tried to do elite interviews in the past, they can be incredibly challenging, just because of the nature of who you're dealing with and also the nature of the interviews themselves. We approached all prime ministers and health secretaries. That was our original key target list. And a range of reasons were presented about why we were not able to interview everyone. And getting people secured for a date was incredibly challenging, as you can imagine. Although the most challenging thing in the end was the fact that I had a baby midway through the interviews, including my waters breaking the night before we were due to interview Sajid Javid. So I literally spent that evening after my waters broke sending "sorry, my waters broke" emails to David Cameron's office and Sajid Javid's office, which was interesting and amusing, to say the least. And then we applied standard qualitative thematic analysis to our analysis, which again, I'm very happy to talk about our coding framework and the literature that we based our initial coding framework on. And then we very, very intentionally published our transcripts for more research to be done for the context, so people could see these quotes that we'd extracted in context of the rest of the interviews, and purely for enjoyment. And I really hope and encourage lots of you to go to the Nesta website to read the transcripts, because they are absolutely fascinating in and of themselves. And also very conscious that we interviewed, a selection of the people involved in the policy process. These were very much just the politicians, and our dream would have been to interview civil servants and special advisors and lots of the other key ministers as well, but we obviously had to limit our capacity. But I really hope that this inspires that research to be done, future research to be done like this. Very happy to do it myself if anyone wants to collaborate on that. And I would love it to be done in other countries. I've already had conversations here in Australia, where I am, with people who are wanting to do that, which is really exciting. So use the transcripts, analyze them in all the ways that you want to, and I really hope people are inspired to do more interviews like it. So here's who we interviewed. I put them basically in chronological order, starting from William Waldegrave up in the top left corner. And the colours that their names are in are the colours of their political party. So blue for Conservative, red for Labour, and yellowy orange for Lib Dems. And they're broadly in chronological order of their most sort of relevant, highest position in office, because lots of them held multiple positions. We interviewed 3 prime ministers, 1 deputy prime minister, 10 health secretaries, 3 chancellors, 2 of whom were also health secretaries, 2 public health ministers, and 3 mayors, 1 who was also a prime minister, Boris Johnson, and 1 who was also a health secretary, Andy Burnham. So what did we find? All 20 politicians agreed that food-related ill health was a big problem, and everyone described it as this massive problem. Various people reflected on the fact that we know today how critical the problem is, but that wasn't always the case when they were in office. For example, Tony Blair said, "During my time in office, there was a growing awareness of the issue, but it wasn't yet considered a top priority in the way it has become in more recent years." And lots of them linked the issue to individuals, the cost to individuals, the burden on individuals, the NHS, and our economy. For example, Boris Johnson said, well, 1 in every 3 of government spending, £1 in every 3 of government spending is on the NHS. And there's no doubt at all that people's life expectancy has been greatly shortened by obesity. And it was interesting having people like Nick Clegg saying how ripe this agenda is now, and also loved this quote from George Osborne saying, what's the point of occupying number 11 Downing Street, or indeed number 10 Downing Street, if you're not going to do something with it? And I couldn't agree more. So what were the four main barriers that politicians face? And this is, a collection of them looking horrified at the barriers that they have to face. The first one, very key, and probably very familiar to lots, if not all of you, is Merry England versus the nanny state. That any political attempt to influence how people eat is attacked by libertarians in Westminster and the media as interfering, joyless, and nanny state. Although the public does not tend to share this view, and fear was greater than reality among the politicians, the attacks are so ferocious to generate considerable political anxiety. But flaws in the nanny state argument were highlighted. And what was interesting is that the general sense you get from the interviews reading them is that this is a negative agenda. The perception that sort of middle-class elites, this wonderful quote from Patricia Hewitt, here I was, a middle-class feminist woman with a Southern constituency, and there was John Reid, who was her predecessor, who was a health secretary before her, the working class Glaswegian, who was adamant that people needed to be able to go to the pub after work and enjoy a pint and fag and a bag of crisps. So this was a sort of middle-class elites telling you to eat boring, joyless food and taking away choice and wanting to introduce regulations to industry. So there was this sort of negative atmosphere surrounding quite a lot of the descriptions of this agenda, of what it felt like to deal with it. A nanny state is a highly effective and tight rhetorical weapon, and there isn't really an equivalently effective counter term. And countering the negative assumptions required explanation. For example, when you're trying to explain that buy one, get one frees don't actually save people money, they're there to encourage people to impulse buy and therefore spend more, and the government's own research shows this, you're still having to explain that. And buy one, get one free saving money is much more intuitive. And I thought it was wonderful when William Hague talked about the fact that most of the time in politics, when you're explaining, you're losing. So you're constantly on this agenda having to explain, actually, no, it's not that, it's this instead. But the accusations seem to only come from certain people, particularly libertarian colleagues in Westminster and the right-wing media. So it wasn't from everyone, although some of the interviewees assumed that the public felt the same about not wanting a kind of nanny state government. But we know the public does not tend to share this view, and think about the public popularity of previous public health policies as well. And then in here, really interestingly, is that the fear of nanny statism tended to be greater than the reality that people experienced. And once policies were actually implemented, they experienced their popularity, or the fact that people didn't really notice. And Sajid Javid in the interview said, once you've done it, it's hard to see how anyone's going to go shopping and say, oh my God, I went into Marks and Spencer's in Birmingham and it was bloody awful because I couldn't reach my chocolate as soon as I got to the till. No one's going to say that, right? Everyone's going to think, like, what was the fuss about? And then here we have an example of William Hague actually saying that the flaws in the nanny state argument are frustrating. The fact that most Conservatives will say that they believe in a smaller state, but there's very little prospect of a smaller state if we spend ever escalating amounts on dealing with unnecessary ill health. Nick Clegg was someone who really touched upon this very interesting thing, another sort of little theme that came up in some of the interviews around class, food and politics, sort of not wanting to be seen as sort of an out of touch elite, which he sums up here by saying it's bound up with this weird, food is bound up with this weird thing we have about class in Britain, this myth that somehow fresh nutritional produce is a sort of middle class thing. It's super weird. It just doesn't exist in other societies. And again, I would read his transcript in full, because he talks about the fact that his wife is from this small Spanish village and they just have a much better food culture. And why is that? And he was sort of asking us, why is it? You're the experts. Can't you tell me? So really fascinating links between class and politics. And food is often used, I've put these collection of photos here, because food is so often used as a key political tool particularly during election campaigns, to be seen as being sort of down with the people and not out of touch. So foods like fish and chips and stuff, you'll see politicians during the election campaigns on those. So the second major barrier we identified was mixing business with politics, that government faces a conflict of interest in its relationship with industry, oscillating between both champion and regulator. Politicians see that obesity as commercially driven, and that came across really interestingly, strongly, but often feel unable to legislate due to lobbying and fears about the impact of policies on businesses and the economy. Interviewees were well aware of the commercial forces that have driven food-related ill health. So William Waldegrave, who was the sort of earliest health secretary, he was actually appointed by Margaret Thatcher in her last days as Prime Minister. He said there were very strong things going the other way, of course. Deep societal things like the shift to fast food and less home cooking, and huge industries surrounding those various burgeoning fast food things. And even former Labour Prime Minister Tony Blair said, we can directly see the causal link between the unhealthy food environment that has grown with the rapidly increasing rates of obesity that we see in young children, teens, and adults. But here is an example of that Michael Gove was giving of the sort of rhetoric you would hear in government of, why do you want to undermine a commercial success in this country? British sugar is a huge success. Why would you want to not have a single sugar beet grown in East Anglia and people losing their jobs in the Docklands? These are the sorts of worries that you hear across government, particularly in other departments, sort of lobbied at the health secretary or lobbied at the Prime Minister if they're trying to introduce it. And then Joe Churchill very frankly saying, who was a former Conservative public health minister, future governments are going to be as lobbied by the food industry as we were, and the people before us were, and the people before them were. And very interestingly, lots of them talked about, when they were talking about lobbying from commercial television. And here's Andy Burnham. The biggest one that I recall was commercial television. They lobbied me hard. And some talked about the enormity of government policy trying to counter those huge commercial forces. So Patricia Hewitt, a former Labour health secretary, said that government policy was too little, too weak in the face of the availability, the cheapness, the tastiness, the ease of junk food. And it was interesting actually with Andy Burnham and Jeremy Hunt as well, two people who had also been culture secretary, that they'd experienced being the Secretary of State responsible for the advertising industry and protecting those interests. So they had seen both sides. But we see here that challenge of when you are in government and how there's sort of the conflicts that government faces between being champion and regulator can even play out within these individual political careers. So despite the fact that Jeremy Hunt was the longest serving health secretary and had regretted, as we see here, not doing more during his time in office, he said, I wish in particular we had made more progress with kids' obesity, where most people are less sensitive to the nanny state argument. So despite that, when he was Chancellor, after being health secretary, he celebrated PepsiCo UK's largest investment in Britain for 25 years, which the company themselves said would lead to an 11,000 annual ton expansion in the production of snacks in the UK per year. So you can see these tensions that can play out even within individual careers. The third major barrier was what we called the struggle to juggle. So since the problem of food-related ill health has occurred gradually, it's seen as important but not urgent and rarely makes it to the top of the political agenda. With so many other pressing issues in the 24-hour news cycle, this one has not had the necessary focus and energy. And put simply, as Patricia Hewitt says here, you simply can't do everything at once. And that came across really strongly, that you have politicians describing a vast array of policy agendas to try and prioritise it. But even within health, immediate, urgent NHS issues took precedence always. Everyone who had been in that position said that. And then within the public health agenda, people described government not being able to do everything. For example, tackling smoking and then seeing how that went before tackling other public health issues. So you had people like Alan Johnson saying, you know, we went big on tobacco control, and same with Patricia Hewitt, went big on tobacco control. So we were going to see, you know, how did that land before trying to tackle everything else. And this linked to the issue of political capital, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, that food-related ill health was considered to require a lot of political capital. It was sort of expensive politically. It was a difficult agenda to get agreement on and support for. So required politicians to use extra energy, and there were sort of negative interactions that could be, you know, time absorbing and difficult also to navigate, to make this stuff happen. And Andrew Lansley described colleagues in government just wishing he would stop with the public health policies because they were so politically problematic. So it's sort of an energy suck. And then even when it comes to the election time, this wasn't an issue politicians said constituents or voters wrote to them about, demanding action. So how can that kind of demand be demonstrated more with the sort of public, as we know from public polling research and citizens engagement research, that the public is generally very supportive of action. How can you get that demand more? And so here's Sajid Javid saying, you know, you have to think in an election especially that it's taking airtime from something else you could be talking about that could be sort of more impactful in terms of votes. So how do you make this issue a vote winner? Also, some talked about how colleagues often saw publishing a strategy as the successful outcome rather than the beginning of the process of full implementation. So former Conservative Health Secretary from early days, Virginia Bottomley, said many think a press notice is an implementation plan, but there's a vast difference between a press notice or a white paper or green paper and an implementation plan actually delivering results. Also, interviewees did recognise that tackling food-related ill health would actually help reduce the cost of the NHS and reduce the burden on the NHS. And that being health secretary was not just about NHS management. And it was great to hear William Waldegrave, former Conservative health secretary, say, I was Secretary of State for Health, not the Secretary of State for the Health Service. And that sometimes got lost in the political debate. The fourth main barrier we found was what we called whacker policy. Because the food system is such a complex, multifaceted and sprawling issue, tackling it can feel like a game of whack-a-mole. Multiple actions are needed, outcomes not always predictable, and responsibility is spread across multiple government departments. Collaboration and securing that cross-government agreement is tremendously hard. So David Cameron here saying tackling obesity is a job for more than just the Department of Health. In this case, Treasury and health ministers work together to create a pragmatic, workable solution. This is in fact a job for the whole of government: education, business, science, DEFRA, work and pensions. So many departments have a role to play in changing what we teach, the industries we back, the food we eat, and the choices we incentivize. The cross-departmental nature of this agenda literally cannot be emphasized enough. And former Conservative Public Health Minister Joe Churchill said that the ability to get stuff through the right round process, which we talk about in this, where you're trying to get, it's where government tries to get cross-departmental agreement. It's not for everything, but a very key mechanism for that. She says right round was virtually impossible in an area like this, virtually impossible in an area like this. Other departments not only saw this as not their responsibility, but often had competing interests, as I touched upon earlier, whether it's, you know, if you're the Chancellor in Treasury and trying to champion these massive industries, or you're in the Department of Culture, Media and Sport and you've got the advertising industry, or DEFRA and you're representing the, you know, big agriculture, whatever it is, there are these literal competing interests as well. So very, very difficult to get that. And Alan Milburn says, you know, it's so complex, it's so difficult, it's so upstream. How do you get your arms wrapped around it? Another major issue was the changeover of ministers in government, which again will not be surprising to many of you. So again, Joe Churchill said, which I'm sure any civil servants on the call will empathise with this. But Joe Churchill, former public health minister, said, I feel sorry at times for the civil servants, especially the excellent ones, because they push and push and push and push a policy and then no control, change of minister, change of government, world event, and then it goes down again. So this sort of almost nightmarish merry-go-round with changes in government and changes through elections and ministerial appointments. And then with something as complex as food-related health, government can't know what will happen when various levers are pulled. So there's always this element of uncertainty and an element of needing to experiment and even introduce policies in order to build the evidence. And Alan Milburn in his interview is really interesting on this particular, on the kind of mechanisms of government. So if you're interested in that part, I would read Alan Milburn's transcript. He said, almost by definition, if you're stepping into new terrain, there is no evidence. Also, a really interesting point raised about evidence and the fact that the science changes. So although it's a good thing that science changes and shows that we are obviously continuing to learn, this came up in the interviews as being unhelpful politically, because government may end up introducing something that turns out to be wrong down the line. Reformulation is an example of something that government has gone really big on for years. But we now know that because food companies have replaced ingredients such as sugar with things like sweeteners, that this may not be good for health. So what does the government do now if suddenly the reformulation program isn't necessarily the optimum route it should be going down for health? How does it respond? And also, how can experts on the outside help guide almost politicians through that changing science in a way that feels comfortable and politically sellable and acceptable as well? So that was a really interesting result that came through. But we also had amazing examples of where politicians spoke about introducing policies and having measurable results within single parliamentary terms. Sadiq Khan talked about his ban on junk food advertising on the Transport for London system, which showed evidence of success literally only a few years after being brought into force. So you can have these policies showing results in small periods of time. George Osborne's soft drinks industry levy is another one that ended up having research, lots of it done through the MRC epidemiology unit at Cambridge, showing the effectiveness of that on all sorts of outcomes. So you can do it. So into the very important part, and I'll try and be as quick as possible so we can move on to questions, but the key ingredients for success. So despite these enormous challenges, the politicians that we interviewed were not at all defeatist. On the contrary, they were actually brimming with optimism, ideas, and advice for future governments. And we identified 4 main ingredients for success. And here's Alan Johnson, former Labour Health Secretary, saying the first thing you have to try and do politically is to make sure that parliamentarians and others understand that this is not wishful thinking, that there is a solution to this problem, that it's not too big to resolve. So the first thing to do is to deploy a compelling argument. Change begins with an argument, as Alan Milburn said. A powerful, persuasive argument is a political superpower. Combine robust evidence with careful framing and existing policy ideas to make an irrefutable case. No need to reinvent the wheel. There are effective policy solutions ready to go. And framing this issue well was considered so key in a lot of the interviews. And interviewees talked about a range of ways to frame this agenda, including giving the gift of hope, a bit of what Alan Johnson's quote just before was talking about, making this a positive, hope-filled agenda. Lots of them talking about it in the context of Labour government what we have at the moment with their missions, that being a sort of the mission-based, hope-filled government that you can put these in, and also that sitting above lots of government departments, which helps with tackling the kind of whacker policy issues and also the struggle to juggle across different government departments as well. The other one is on another key part of framing this agenda was on exposing the system and how businesses have driven food-related ill health. So we had some people talking about their time in office of saying they went really bold on trying to get much stronger regulation and actually how difficult that was, but exposing the system and helping people understand how businesses have driven this kind of issue is a really effective way that particularly to get public support. Prioritizing children, as it was considered by many as more politically acceptable to intervene to protect children. So that can help when you've got a particularly sort of hostile government that maybe doesn't want to be seen to be intervening in adult decision making, that you can emphasize the need to protect children. Emphasizing fairness, that people should be able to enjoy the same opportunities such as access to good, nutritious food wherever they're from. And also to connect food with other political agendas and priorities, particularly thinking about what others care about and showing that link with food. So thinking about where a government is really leaning into and seeing what those connections are, drawing them with food. And on what policy solutions to go for, interviewees talked about not needing to reinvent the wheel. So interestingly, as government should just get on with implementing policies already in motion or proposed, but not fully implemented, which I know from my own research, there are literally hundreds of, and anytime I'm doing media and asked, what's the one thing government should do? I always say, if it could just implement the last strategy published on this agenda in full, it would be just doing something no government has done before. So there was no need to reinvent the wheel, just keep going with policies that are already in the pipeline, already in motion, have been delayed perhaps, which actually brilliantly the Labour government at the moment is doing on some key policies, like the key marketing policies that are due to come into force this year. And making sure these aren't, any other policies aren't further delayed, watered down, or scrapped. And also picking up on policy recommendations already out there, like with government commissioned research and reviews, like the National Food Strategy. And also we've had the recent House of Lords, superb House of Lords report, of which there are so many brilliant recommendations to pick on. And many talked about utilising pretty hard levers. Many talked about tax. Many talked about mandatory regulations as well as being key. And actually, former Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron said, nudging consumers alone is not enough. You also need to give the companies a shove. Secondly, build a movement. So support exists, but needs marshalling in Westminster, this active engagement and building of support. The public already wants government to introduce strong action on the food industry and help people access healthy food. And actually influential people like Jamie Oliver. Jamie Oliver was mentioned so many times by so many people. It was fascinating. Henry Dimbleby, again, another person who was mentioned. And interestingly, William Hague made the point. Henry wasn't actually on the interview with William Hague. I gave it. And he said, I'm not just mentioning Henry because he's part of your project. I've been writing about this for ages. So it was interesting that he also came up and how important the National Food Strategy was. That nothing we quoted this idea of nothing worth achieving can be achieved alone. The really key thing here is about the support, that support exists, but politicians need to be part of actively building that. They can't just sort of announce something and expect that support to land. You actually need to help curate it. And I'll give an example of it in a couple of slides on the soft drinks industry levy. And for people listening now on the outside, helping to build, coordinate and amplify the positive, supportive atmosphere is really key. So how can you make this agenda something politicians want to be a part of, want to lead on, want to build a legacy on? How can we move away from that negative atmosphere that lots of the interviewees were describing, which is about it being sort of seen as this, Nanny say, interventionist, etc., regulating industry, hampering industry, and sort of think about what are the positive reframings that could be done, and also where are those feedback loops? How are politicians hearing that this is something that voters want, that constituents want, that there's support for, etc., etc. And at the moment, particularly from these interviews, it doesn't sound like that supportive feedback loop is very strong for politicians, particularly at the top of government. Thirdly, enlist the Prime Minister or Mayor at the local level. So at the local level, food-related ill health should be a prime ministerial priority, and lots of the prime ministers we interviewed talked about this. The Prime Minister has the power to unify government around a common goal, pushing it to the top of the agenda and authorising key departments to pull the necessary levers. As Matt Hancock said, if the Prime Minister isn't on side, if the Prime Minister isn't enthusiastic about the policy area, then one individual cabinet minister who's determined enough can kill it. And if you want to hear about who he was talking about in particular, then you can go to his transcript. And here's Sadiq Khan as a mayor at the local level, who really emphasised how much he had, sort of taken it upon himself to make sure the funding was there, that he didn't have a huge amount of national support at the national level. He says, although I will continue to make it a policy priority, there is no guarantee that the next mayor, whoever they may be, will do the same. And that comes to that point of the ministerial turnover. So again, how can we get this at the top of the most senior person in government at each level's agenda, and to maintain that when those turnovers happen? And that's partly linked to the sort of building that support and positivity around it. So finally, be bold, act fast, and no regrets. So changing policy is hard, or as Alan Milburn says, it's fucking hard, especially on food-related ill health. But if politicians move fast and aim high, they can leave a lasting legacy with measurable rewards reaped in single parliamentary terms, which is what we were touching on before. And I love this quote from Seema Kennedy, former Conservative Minister for Public Health. Stop faffing around, she said, to speak to politicians today and of the future. Just get on with it. And here's David Cameron, former Conservative Prime Minister, saying, the final lesson is that real change happens when you're bold, but that boldness must be underpinned by deep understanding of the problem and specific targeted policies to address it. And interviewees were so strong in their emphasis that politicians should embrace this agenda and go as bold as possible. And interestingly, it wasn't the case that they were saying, look, you know, I've tried to go big on this agenda. Don't do it. It's terrible. Don't do it. They didn't say that at all. It was the opposite. The clear message was not to delay, do as much as possible, as early as possible, and to go as bold as possible. And for example, we know that voluntary policies don't work, and we know that we need to change the food system. So government should just implement as much as possible, like these existing policy recommendations that have been proposed even by government itself that haven't got through, and they'll likely see these measurable positive results quickly. But recognizing that achieving this is hard. As Alan says, it's hard, it's fucking hard. But the truth is there's a series of levers that you can pull. Ding, 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 ding. This we used as a case study. It was just such an interesting one of where all the sort of conditions, the political conditions to make this work happened with the soft drinks industry levy. And it partly seems to explain why it's ended up being this huge success story and has stayed over many years and changes in government despite being threatened, as I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. It's been threatened through new leaders coming through and saying that they're going to scrap it, or new governments coming through saying they're going to scrap it, but it has survived. And the sort of one of the key elements to it, and again, I would emphasize reading George Osborne's transcript, but actually a lot of people that we interviewed mentioned the soft drinks industry levy, really did mention it a lot. So it's worth reading them in full if you're interested about that. But the SEIL was an incredibly carefully and intentionally designed policy, which included a really careful consideration of all the potential political blocks and working through them. And George Osborne in his interview described how food taxes were one of the hardest things to ever do in government, and that there is a long history of disasters, including his own pasty tax, which many of you will remember. So he knew he would have to do this really carefully, which helped make it work so well. He also actively, he says, I would say it could easily have gone wrong with the sugar tax, and we knew that, but it was worth it, and it was worth risking, trying. And he actively set up the support. So going back to what I was talking about in terms of building a movement and the kind of active role that politicians also need to play in helping build the success, build the support around the policies, but even before they're announced. He did this with Jamie Oliver. He saw how key Jamie Oliver could be in helping it land well. And he literally phoned him up. I phoned Jamie Oliver and said, the moment I announced the soft drinks industry levy, I need you out there publicly. He and others did come out in force and fought off an attempt by the drinks industry to either get rid of it or water it down. And this is George Osborne, a picture of him with Theresa May and David Cameron on the day that he announced it, and Jamie Oliver celebrating on College Green behind him on the day that he announced it. And he had persuaded, also George Osborne had persuaded David Cameron, who was skeptical, and he talks about this in his interview, and initially opposed to it as well, by saying that they were experienced enough politicians to make the politics works. And this reminds me of something, a quote that I was told Tony Blair said, which is basically that you can make the politics work for anything if you want to. It just requires an active effort. And George Osborne also designed the soft drinks industry levy in full secret, which he talks about, to prevent it from being blocked by the food industry and right-wing media before it had been carefully designed. And this gave him and his colleagues, who a very small group of colleagues who knew about it, the kind of creative and intellectual space to think through all the issues without having to expend lots of their time and energy defending essentially an unfinished idea in public, or having industry try and water it down. And then finally, don't leave office eating what I like to call regretty spaghetti. So politicians urged their successors not to leave office, wishing they had done more. And some talked about not being bold enough when they were in office, while those who did a lot said that they were immensely proud. Here's Alan Johnson saying that we were pondering on a sugar tax, but we were never really bold enough to do it. This sort of sentiment. And also you would have seen from Jeremy Hunt earlier, I wish we'd done more on childhood obesity. And the politicians who didn't experience regret were those who had gone big, such as George Osborne on the soft drinks industry levy. And he said, it was interesting, at the end of my 6 years as Chancellor, I look back on the sugar tax as one of the things I'm still proud of. So no leaving office eating regretty spaghetti. And the final 3 points I want to leave you with are that politicians and government should go for it. Their predecessors say, act now, be bold, and don't leave office regretting you hadn't done more. Second, that everyone in this space, so everyone listening, if you're involved in this space, you can help make this a positive agenda and help build the support that politicians can feel, including via voters and constituents. And many of you will be voters and constituents, so to contact your own politicians, your own members of parliament about this agenda as well. And finally, that politicians can make the politics on this agenda work, and they can see positive results reaped in politically very short periods of time. And you can download the full manual and all of the interview transcripts on the Nesta website. I don't know whether, Christina, you want me to leave this up or whether we want faces, but I can.
I think it'd be nice for people to see you respond, Dolly, if that's okay.
Great.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you for such an amazing presentation. We have had huge amounts of compliments in the Q&A in the chat saying, wow, Dolly just has so much energy and enthusiasm and commitment, and how can we actually get that infiltrated into our politicians to take action. So thanks so much for your really energetic and engaging and really novel findings. It's so insightful to hear from politicians about the causes of inertia and actually the regrets. Like, that's incredibly interesting. I just wanted to pick up on a few points. So we've had a huge number of questions. I'm going to try and group them together as much as possible. We will go probably till about 10:15. So hang online with us if you can. If you need to dip off, please do check out again the recording on our YouTube channel, our Centre for Food Policy YouTube channel. But Dolly, I just wanted to pick up on a point which hasn't currently been raised in the Q&A, which is of interest to mine, and the point around implementation. So often politicians think that making the policy is it, and actually very little thought is put into implementation, into enforcement, my particular bugbear, and also into regular monitoring to refine policies, to close loopholes, to keep up with evidence, thinking about the nutrient profile model that we've got. Just wondering, how do we do that? And is that even on politicians' radars, or do we need to work more with civil servants around that? Like, what is the process for getting the policy, but then actually getting a really good implementation, monitoring, and, you know, refinement process underway?
Oh my gosh, if I had the answer to that. I mean, if you read the transcripts, the one that comes to mind immediately, listening to you ask that, is Nick Clegg's, because he just talked about how there's this expectation that politicians are in control of what's happening much more than they actually are, and he sort of describes this feeling of being buffeted about, you know. And it just felt, again, from the interviews, that you just had this sense that issue after issue was coming to their desk, and there was just sort of almost an overwhelming amount to deal with. And so implementation, which is so hard to kind of make it, you know, interesting and almost the sexy, cool thing to do politically. But I would just say all of the stuff around support building and momentum building, if it can emphasize that element of it, then amazing. And also the kind of mandatory nature of it, that if you secure that element as early as possible, that is critical, you know, but giving the sort of little wiggle room. It was interesting how many of them sort of reflected on the sort of weakness of the approach, and the fact that they would have gone more. And this looking, so many of them talked about the soft drinks industry levy, and, you know, and then talking about tax as this great way that's sort of a much harder kind of set, you know, set non-vulnerable policy lever to pull. So again, it's the policy type we're asking for, and I think as much as possible that mandatory. And I have to say that the House of Lords report was really good at sort of having this unquestioning emphasis on a mandatory approach, that just makes sure that that sort of robustness comes in. But it's very difficult, I think, but that continuous supportive momentum. But, you know, civil servants are absolutely critical to the you know, seeing these things through. But I think having it as a good agenda, as a legacy builder and a positive agenda that politicians want to be a part of, is obviously going to help it remain at the top when they're being buffeted.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, having it as part of the ask, that, you know, monitoring, enforcement and review of the regulation is actually enlisted within the regulation in a timely manner, in the same way that evaluation often is. I agree, and have that as part of the ask, because there can be a bit of an argument to say, actually, that's more off-putting. So just trying to get, you know, sort of an initial regulation is important, but and then you work on refinement. But I guess having it part of the ask is really sensible. So thank you very much. There's a great question from Dan Crosley that really touches a bit on, many of the statements came around saying it's more ripe for action now than when they were in power. And is that because the statistics are still getting worse in terms of inequalities and obesity? Is it because societal attitudes are changing? Or as Dan Crosley from the Food Ethics Council says, how much regret, if any, did the interviewees show for, in most cases, failing to take diet-related health seriously? And did the interviews galvanize any of them to say that they would push for greater action to go forward now through their policy, their political contacts and their political connection? So I guess there's two things. One is they're saying that actually it's riper now than it was for them. Why is that? And the second question is, did they say that they're going to actually support momentum to push things now with current politicians?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and one I found fascinating as well. Also, you will all appreciate, but the nightmare of these interviews is that you're just left with more questions like every time. You sort of think you've got these wonderful opportunities, but just some of the nuttiness, like interviewing Boris Johnson on the phone while he was in Buenos Aires and having sort of 20 minutes to try and get everything asked was incredibly challenging. So I myself have many more questions that I would love to ask and follow up with our interviewees about on that. But the impression I got was, even if you looked at it chronologically, you've got someone like William Waldegrave, and even going back to his transcript is a really interesting one, because it was sort of the start, and it really was the start because he was behind the first green paper that had the first adult obesity reduction targets that the government had ever published. So it was sort of, and he talked about the Health of the Nation green paper as being basically the first modern time public health strategy that the government had published. So a kind of really key person and a really key moment. And he talks about, I'd actually interviewed him previously, which is also available if anyone wants to read that, because it has a little bit more detail than we have on the transcript on certain elements of it, including how Margaret Thatcher appointed him, which is a very funny story, over whiskey. And he talks about the fact that they were so interested in food safety. And, so actually looking at these chemicals that were sort of there to really enhance food safety and make sure that that was the top of the agenda of the food side as well. And then and cardiovascular disease. So it was much more these specific disease outcomes rather than obesity levels at that time. So when he talks a bit about that in the interview, but there are sort of this learning moment that you can see happen. And it just feels like now, Michael Gove actually was another one who just said that people are much more conscious of food these days. And that has grown even the time that he was education secretary, when he commissioned Henry Dimbleby to do the school food plan. So I think it genuinely has grown politically in the same way that it has grown in with the public, that this is a very, very much more topical issue. You see it written about, daily, literally in the newspaper. And again, with kind of obesity rates rising in that time, the 2000s onwards, it feels like politically that made sense. But obviously it could also be a bit of a, you get clarity once you're out of politics. And at the time, you're just trying to deal with the mayhem.
And we all get that with, retrospective vision, don't we? But yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you very much. And I don't want to take away from the fact this is incredibly novel data set, and what you've done is amazing. So, we do always ask more questions, but it's excellent to have this sort of very rich data set that researchers can tap into to get more from. So that's really excellent. Anthony So has a question about the nanny state, and there's a couple of other questions that sort of focus on the same topic. And Anthony says your report identifies the nanny state narrative as one of the key obstacles for progress. And you are someone that stood as a Conservative candidate in 2017 at the general election. Can you provide any kind of unique perspective on three key issues? He said, sort of, one is, what is the instinctive anti-nanny state position rooted in? And then the second is, how did the Conservative government deal with its own anti-nanny state libertarian backbenchers, while also successfully implementing the sugar drinks levy, the soft drinks industry levy, which is described as one of the greatest interventions? And then thirdly, what makes cross-party consensus to address issues that you identify across several parliamentary terms so difficult to achieve, based on sort of that nanny state rhetoric?
Yeah, so I'm very grateful to you asking that, because I feel like I spend so much of my time, my brain time, at night and day, thinking about that question. Because again, because of my own kind of political background and sort of history with being in a party that has traditionally been seen as sort of being hostile potentially, you know, or unhealthy, or being incompatible with this kind of intervention, and me personally not agreeing with that, and so trying to think of the arguments that can sort of align and marry up these sort of ideological positions with the sort of policies and positions on this agenda. And actually, William Hague has written some really interesting pieces in his Times column about just this. So making the kind of pro-conservative case for intervention on health, and talking about how good health, you know, conservatives will say they value freedom. Nothing is more important to people's personal freedom and liberty than good health. And also the fact that we live in an environment that doesn't really offer lots of choice, and people talk about just having the freedom to choose. But, you know, someone joked to me from a friend from the Conservative Party was saying, you can have anything as long as it's ultra processed food. And it's true to an extent that we don't actually have that kind of choice. I'm actually experiencing quite a lot of people from the Conservative Party, particularly very hostile libertarians, friends of mine who've almost sort of, you know, trolled me for being involved in the nanny state agenda for years. They're starting to convert, and the kind of arguments that are persuading them are around the fact that a lot of them enjoy food, you know, good food, and want that, and see it that actually the kind of environment that we've been lumped with because of the commercial drivers are actually not allowing even them to enjoy access to good food. So that kind of, you don't actually have choice and you don't have those options out there, is a really effective one. And again, that comes back down to the kind of positive, supportive type of tone around this agenda. I come at this from someone who just wants to enjoy food, and I want everyone to be able to enjoy good food, and I don't want people to have to eat diets that make them ill. Or that aren't enjoyable, and that should be absolutely easy, affordable, and convenient for everyone. And that seems to be, again, a frame that resonates with people that otherwise wouldn't like the sort of nanny state intervention, because a lot of it is around, you know, this perception of being told to be on diets or boring food, or, you know, it's all that kind of stuff, or there being a judgment. Food is very sensitive and very personal, and so taking that away and just making it about enjoyment and access to that for everyone. But it taps into a lot of economic arguments. The other argument I would also say, which is really interesting because it's a lot of Australian researchers who are producing this at the moment, but libertarians who are talking about being pro the free market, but sort of agreeing that there are negative externalities that are occurring, and also that you don't really have this kind of free and vibrant market when you've got essentially a handful of companies, an oligopoly in all of these major systems. And that also seems to be resonating with quite a lot of libertarian you know, conservative people that I'm talking to about this agenda, that they don't like the idea that essentially a handful of companies are controlling the market, blocking entry for new businesses, and there isn't this kind of thriving small and medium enterprises that are independent of the large corporations, being able to kind of run businesses and being embedded within their communities, and also connecting people with farmers and all these other agendas. These are the sorts of things that seem to be resonating alongside the sort of protecting British food and celebrating British culture, which the ultra-processed food agenda, interestingly, is the one that seems to help, because it's not about saying you can't have pies and burgers and all these things that, you know, baked beans or whatever, but you can have non-ultra processed versions of those. And that also seems to be an argument that is resonating at the moment. But that's all from my own personal experience, and haven't done the kind of hard research on that yet. So I would caveat all of that.
But there's some really insightful points that you make there. And I think one links to one of the other questions that rose for me during your presentation, was that it is really interesting that so many politicians who have had a very privileged upbringing perceive that lower income families want to eat unhealthy foods without actually the acknowledgement that they are trapped in a cycle of not having a choice. And so one of my questions then was about, having heard from politicians and your experience more broadly in sort of that gentle lobbying or, you know, discussion space where you have the opportunity to influence ideas and ideology, is how do we as research create that kind of awareness of what is the reality for so many families living on a lower income where they just don't have a choice, and healthy eating is not really obtainable at all for them. Is it through lived experience research? Do we do that through, you know, what do you think is effective? What cuts through?
It's everything from the language. I mean, I have to work on this all the time, because there tends to be a language that we don't even in the research space, we don't even realize we're sort of adopting, because it's the way that we talk about it. And it's interesting that even the politicians tend to fall onto the burden on the individual, burden on the NHS. And we know from Frameworks Institute that, you know, we should be moving away from those frames and talking about the conditions. So being very conscious of language and absolutely leading with that, and also leading with the positive argument that this is, you know, everyone, it's sort of irrefutable statements. So sort of everyone wants to enjoy good food, and obviously people don't want to eat food that makes them sick, you know, and yet it's incredibly hard to do that. You're just immediately moving the arguments away from the attention on the kind of individual choices towards the difficulty people face when they're navigating a system that makes it very, very difficult, and is basically making the decisions for them, setting the prices, you know, setting the options they have available, marketing so aggressively that they're sort of deciding, they're telling you what you like, and the rest of it. So the language that we use, and I think lived experience couldn't be more important. And I have to say, Food Farming Countryside Commission has done a superb job with their citizens conversation, the food conversation, and their citizens assemblies that they've been running, because it feels like they've absolutely made sure that they've represented that opinion, and also shown the kind of political diversity of that, the income diversity, et cetera, that people across all spectrums are coming at this of wanting the government to help on this.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and thanks so much. It's fascinating just trying to make that personal connection as well. What you picking up what you said before, you know, trying to touch on something that people experience and politicians do experience themselves, and then how that can relate to people that are living in similar circumstances to them or very different circumstances. Yeah, thank you very much. So moving on now a bit more to sort of lobbying and commercial interests, and just there's a great question here from Mary C. I wonder how much of an effect does supermarket and pharmaceutical lobbying have on the government's interest in prevention in childhood obesity? And I also was just wondering about how do we really curb lobbying and commercial economic gain and economic value, particularly now? So just, you know, Rachel Reeves is experiencing a lot of backlash about some of her actions to recalibrate the distribution of wealth, and that's kind of what we're at here as well. And do you know what are your thoughts, and what from the transcripts and the conversations that we had, what do you think we should be doing around that?
Well, I mean, looking at the transcripts through the lens of the exposing the system, and seeing how politicians, when they do talk about industry, how they're talking about it, it's just really interesting. Also, the transcripts are full, as we all are, full of sort of mixed arguments and, you know, mixed perspectives, and there's so many fascinating lenses through which they can be analysed. So, but you know, it was interesting how aware a lot of the people were about the commercial drivers, or talked about it throughout the transcript. So not necessarily when we initially talk to them about why the problem, you know, there is this problem, and or sort of how they think about it. Often they'll have an immediate response to that. And then the commercial drivers was something that often came out later and later. I was very struck personally by the fact that when interviewees talked about sort of protecting business interests and not wanting to be seen to be regulating or put a burden on businesses, they tended to be talking about big businesses. I didn't have anyone, and actually I've had a conversation with certain politicians who otherwise would not consider themselves interested in the public health agenda at all, but are interested in protecting communities and protecting small businesses and protecting farmers. They are having the interesting conversations at the moment of going, those voices of smaller businesses, smaller independent businesses, are just not being talked about. They're not being prioritized in the political agenda. It's basically sort of the corporatization, the corporate interests that are. So I think I'm very interested, again, from the earlier question about nanny statism, and particularly centre-right people that I talk to about this, when they're sort of comfortable with being seen to be pro-business, that you can actually lean into that argument by saying there are lots of businesses, you know, these natural food companies that are much smaller players in the market. How can we be creating the kind of commercial conditions that help them thrive, and have lots of them across the country? And people want, you know, to know about their food. They want more information. That's a very pro-libertarian idea. You know, they want that access and transparency, and these big corporates don't provide that. And I've actually been talking to a lot of business leaders at that smaller level at the moment, and it's really interesting the kind of barriers they face because of the major supermarkets dominating the decision making, or the major manufacturers dominating the decision making. So having that pro-business lens by showing that you're supportive of, you know, certain sections can be a really helpful way to navigate that, and also with countering the lobbying. But I would also come back to the House of Lords report and say that the recommendations in there to make sure that lobbying is just a firm part, that removal of conflicts of interest within the decision-making process, particularly at the policy. The soft drinks industry levy was so key because the policy was designed without that influence. And then, of course, industry was brought in through the consultation once the announcement had been made, once the policy had been designed, once it was decided it was a tax, you know, at these two thresholds. All of that had been made, and then the industry was brought in. So it's not saying they're completely blocked out of the conversation. It's just this appropriate engagement level with businesses, and to make sure that all businesses, not just these major corporates, are brought in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's incredibly interesting, actually, that in that process, there's a really clear example of where conflicts of interest were not engaged, because it happens. You know, I couldn't agree with you more about SMEs, small and medium enterprises, and the growth of them is absolutely what we need, particularly for greater strength and resilience in local regional food systems. But one of the caveats with that is they haven't got the capital power to, you know, wine and dine, and some of that, and how that was managed to be totally avoided in the sugar drinks levy is really fascinating. And how do we adopt that and expand that in a much greater rate?
Totally.
Yeah, so thank you. Moving on, we've got two other questions, which are one's from Jenny Armstrong. So she has said that, just basically, how do we build the public demand for this? So Rebecca Wells, Jenny Armstrong have all sort of linked in saying, you know, you talked about high profile celebrities. Rebecca's asking about how, you know, media versus public, and how do we manage that, and how do we bring that on side in a way that really puts pressure on politicians and commercial companies for stronger action?
I mean, I have literally written to my local MP, because I've just got a new MP where we live, and they're a former doctor. So I was like, right, perfect person to ask about this. So, you know, treat yourself as a constituent and as a voter. As I said earlier, I cannot emphasize enough that building the public support, building the demand, and using that as much as possible, encouraging neighbours to. I live in an area where there are coming with my 50-50 Parliament Ask Her to Stand hat on, and I would absolutely emphasize that any amazing people, not just women, amazing people in the food industry space, like a food agenda, to come in and stand for Parliament, because it's you know, or stand at the council level as well. It's a fantastic way to get involved, because we actually don't have a lot of people who come from the food agenda going into politics. So that's one part of it, but also your voters and constituents. So creating that demand yourself, even if it's sort of, you know, you can't write an article or whatever it is, having that time, we all have the ability to create that demand to some extent, and just encouraging the people in your lives, your colleagues, to do the same would be a huge difference. Because as we saw with these interviews, it just wasn't an agenda that politicians were feeling coming into their kind of constituency MP inboxes.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. And the media? Do you know, how do you think we tackle the media in a way that often, I know if I'm ever asked to talk, the conversations always revert back to individual level behavior change, and, you know, you need to reorientate the discussion towards, you know, systems determinants. But just I mean, you are very experienced in talking to the media, and what do you think we can do in that area?
Oh, it's so hard. I mean, I did an interview for this report, and literally this journalist was just like, I just don't agree. It's, it can be incredibly frustrating, but you know, try. A wonderful friend of mine said sometimes you just have to put your frequencies out there, and you just have to, even if you're getting none of the positive feedback loops back that you're sort of, you know, persuading or people agreeing or whatever, you've got to put it out there. And there's one approach to that, but also leaning into the kind of journalists and media that are publishing the sort of stuff that you want to see more of, and sort of amplifying that, getting that out there as much as possible is really key. But I know that amazing work is being done, like Frameworks, Impact on Urban Health. They are trying, whether it's through the kind of images that the media use and trying to move away from the headless people that they put into media, to the kind of language and headlines, you know, trying to engage and use that through press releases and stuff as much as possible. Obviously, publishing your own work and being able to be in control of your words is excellent. But yeah, I would say media is very, very hard. There is a kind of very embedded way of talking about this, and the kind of headlines that come with this. I get it all the time. It is just incredibly challenging and frustrating, but leaning into those journalists who, you know, get this agenda, amplifying their work and trying as much as possible to do your own media and putting those frequencies out there is probably the only way we can try and push this.
Excellent, thank you, Dolly. I'm going to end 2 or 3 more questions, and then we'll finish up. A great question from Scarlett McNally. She says we have 1.7 million NHS workers. How can we use them to influence public politicians, media, etc.? She's the president of the Medical Women's Federation, and she said, please, would you come and talk to them?
I'd be thrilled, thrilled to come and talk to them. Again, you know, I'm like, stand for Parliament, stand for Council, vote, write to your MPs. You know, any action. And I feel like sometimes it can be overwhelming because there's a kind of, you know, you've got to do something big, got to do a big campaign. A lot of the, you know, work that I've done in particular, I've been sort of involved in political campaigning for most of my life. And I would just say, just start with your, you know, smallest expectations, most doable expectations, even if that is sending an email to your local MP today, or your managers in the NHS, or whatever it is, whatever outlets that you have that are easiest, use them and keep using them and seeing kind of what responses you get. Because sometimes sort of expecting to build this entire campaign and entire movement is really hard, but piecing together as much as possible the sorts of powers that we have in our own hands, I would just use that as much as you can. And always, if anyone is actually interested in finding out what it takes to stand for election, because that can often seem like a completely daunting thing. I have stood twice, one at the council level and one at the national level. And I used it knowing I wasn't going to win in either of those seats. I used it as a chance to amplify the agendas that I cared about, to test out some of the messaging and framing around this. It's a fantastic way. You can stand and not even, you know, have to win because you're in an unwinnable seat. That's a very common thing to do. And you can use that to develop your own manifesto and push for the kind of change you want to see.
Excellent optimism, and take action now, isn't it? And one of your key points, take homes. So 2 quick questions, if we can squeeze them in. Naomi Weiner talks about the Lancet Commission in 2019 and talks about the global syndemic of obesity and undernutrition and climate change. And what she's really asking is there something to be gained from reframing policy action in the UK along these lines, particularly when it comes to cross-departmental work in government? So something about framing, farming, climate change, does it have a greater resonance than health that we can, you know, should we be taking that angle?
Yeah, desperate for that to become more felt. And again, I would say read William Waldegrave's transcript, because he talks about that. And said, you know, leaning into the nature connections, the farming connections is really key. And also Michael Gove, because he was DEFRA secretary when he was Environment, Food, Farming secretary when he commissioned the National Food Strategy to be done, and has dealt with a lot of these agendas. And DEFRA's working on a food strategy at the moment, which is due any time. And also the response to the House of Lords report is due at the end of January, or they've said they're going to publish it at the end of January. So those sorts of connections, absolutely. And I mentioned Food Farming Countryside Commission. I would say they're one of the lead organizations that's doing that connecting between those agendas. But it's very hard, you know, a lot of these trying to sort of prioritize both agendas when the environment world can be an entire sort of its own advocacy groups, and you know there's so much on that agenda to be getting on with. And if you prioritize regenerative farming, you know, health is another whole beast to be dealing with as well. So it can be very hard making those connections, but as much as possible, leaning into the crossovers, I think absolutely, and it came up in our interviews. As I say, William Waldegrave and Michael Gove talked about it. There might have been more, but I can't think off the top of my head. But those connecting to other policy agendas, particularly when they are agendas that are on the top of a government's list, and health might not be there, making those connections absolutely critical.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Some of our research has shown that too, actually asking questions to find out which is of political interest to the person, or, you know, of personal interest to the person that you're talking to, and then using the word. If it's about inequalities, then talk about, you know, welfare, or just framing your, using that framing point that you brought in earlier, I think is, yeah, really, really sound advice. So very final question, and this is one that I had. I was wondering, you spoke to mainly national politicians, national level politicians, but a couple of regional mayors. Did you find any key differences between those two different groups? I know there wasn't a lot of mayors, you said 3 mayors, but did you find, apart from a potential frustration of not having national support in what they wanted to do, but was there any other kind of key differences that came out from perspectives?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I should also say, I just saw in the chat people asking about my earrings, and they are avocados. Um, but yes, so we didn't, I mean, again, it's another thing to kind of analyze. From the top of my head, I was struck by the fact that Andy Burnham, Boris Johnson, and Sadiq Khan talked about what they were able to do in a way that would indicate that there was this sort of opportunity to go to really localize and to really lean into the sort of connecting at that level and driving stuff through that was under their powers. But then Sadiq Khan talked about having not a lot of support at the national level and really having to make this active effort to actually provide resource and money to use his mayoral budget to, whether it's on free school meals for primary school children, anything like that, that there was a sort of active prioritization that he had to take. And then Andy Burnham talked a lot about the work that he was doing. He was much more interested about food security. And it was interesting, again, hearing this difference, it's not just about the health side, but food security. And there's obviously, I'd be like, they're the same, food security is access to nutritious food, and that being really important. But he had talked about how he had used his role as mayor to make a lot of connections as much as possible between the various NGOs and charities that were that are in his Greater Manchester patch. So I got from the sense that there was a huge amount of power available at the local level if mayors took this, and obviously Obesity Health Alliance and other brilliant organisations are helping drive through that with trying to get mayors to commit to the advertising regulations that they have control of and all these sorts of things. So there absolutely should be stuff done, but there was a little hint at the difficulty of not having national backing. And I also have to say, before it finishes, an enormous thank you to obviously Henry Dimbleby and his wife, Jemima Lewis, who edited the report, for being just the most superb people to work with, and to Nesta and Impact on Urban Health for helping make the work happen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dolly. As I said, there's a huge number of thank you, and what a fascinating discussion and amazing presentation and great piece of work. So thank you so much. Thank you for sharing this today. It's been incredibly insightful for us all and a really great discussion. Please do look online on our YouTube channel if you wanted to catch up or catch any of our other recordings. And don't forget to tune in on the 12th of February for Professor Paul Burrens at our next Food Thinkers. Thank you so much, Dolly.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.